All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Welcome to our Managing Forests as Habitat in a Changing World. This talk this month will be Finding Refuge in Suburbia, Managing Forests for Habitat in Urban Environments. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and we're going to have some great presenters today, and we'll introduce them later, but we're going to first go over some pre-webinar items. So first of all, make sure that your audio settings are up to date, and if you want closed captioning, we have a wonderful closed captioner who will be doing manual captions. We also have an ASL interpreter as well, and so you have options. I would like to start with our land acknowledgement. Here at the National Conservation Training Center, we understand that we're located on ancestral lands of many Indigenous people, where we couldn't find the full account of everyone who traversed and cherished these lands, but we do know that these people include, but are not limited to, the Massawomack, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. And if you're interested in learning about the people who lived and cherished and traversed through the land that you live and work, let us know and we can help you out to try and figure out who was in the land before you were. Here at the National Conservation Training Center, we also hope to welcome everyone. We acknowledge our agent's history and strive to be a site of cultural transformation for our organization and the larger conservation community around us. And we hope to make this community more representative of the aspirations of the American people. A quick disclaimer, this project is for educational purposes only, and the views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior, and some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mentions of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not apply federal endorsement. That being said, we'll be putting quite a few links in the chat that go in line with our discussion today, and so feel free to check those out. Should be really informative. Also, we are all muted. Well, the participants are muted, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. And so you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. And we will get to that at the end of the webinar. We'll have a half hour at the end where we'll go and answer questions. And that's always a great way to interact with our panelists. Also, the best way to view our webinar is through speaker. And so since all of our panelists are pinned along with our ASL interpreters, you can click speaker and then you can see all of their beautiful faces. Lastly, this is something that you really need to pay attention for. We are switching our webinar from Zoom to Teams next month. And this is also a change in date as well. So we are now having the webinar on October 28th at the same time. So it's noon to 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. And we will be spamming you with the registration link for the Teams webinar series. Throughout this webinar, we'll also send you an email today. Since you are registered for this one, we already have your email, and so we'll be sending that out today, and we'll also send it out a week before the webinar happens. All of the webinars will still be recorded, even though they're being switched over to Teams, and we're trying to make this as seamless as possible. And so if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me. My email is at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be putting links to register for the Teams webinar in the chat throughout this webinar. And so you have to re-sign up and re-register for the Teams webinar. And we'll also add this screen to the end of our webinar as well, just to give you another reminder. And so without further ado, I'll turn the webinar over to Danica, and she'll explain more about what this webinar is all about.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danica Maloney. I am a forest ecologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service with the Midwest region. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on behalf of the Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications and Migratory Birds Program, and the National Conservation Training Center. We are joined by the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and the USDA Forest Service in sponsoring this webinar series. For today, you just heard from Gwyneth. If you have any tech issues, please pass them on to her. Her email is over here and at the bottom there, or if you have access to the chat, you can request tech assistance in the chat as well. Lindsay Grayson will be monitoring today's chat and today's Q&A. And like they said earlier, we are going to be spamming that chat with a link to the next webinar to register for, since we'll be transforming over to a Teams interface. Today's webinar is approved for 1.5 hour continuing education credits. If you need SAF credits, you can contact Jim Siegel. His information is also listed at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please, Gwyneth. And as I just mentioned, I'm going to keep on mentioning, our next webinar is on October 28th. It's on mature and old growth forest. Again, this is going to be turning into a Teams interface. Lindsay, if you would be so kind to drop that into the chat right now, since I am mentioning it and people can click on it if they have the opportunity. Next slide, please. I am very excited to introduce you all to today's panelists. They come from across the United States, the East Coast, West Coast. We have a very wide, diverse group, qualified panel here with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Seth Hawkins. Seth is the Urban and Community Forestry Program Coordinator for the Georgia Forestry Commission, where he and his team work daily with communities across the state to better manage their community forest resources. Seth is a proud graduate of the Warnell School of Forestry at the University of Georgia and is also an ISA certified arborist, municipal specialist, and holds the track qualification, in addition to holding the Society of American Foresters new certified urban forestry professional certification. Seth is located in Rome, Georgia, but works across the state of Georgia to protect and manage trees. Green spaces and community forests provide a great intersection between nature and residents, and Seth takes great pride in helping to protect those spaces. Also with us today is Mike Martini. Mike is the Director of Urban and Community Forestry at the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, where he leads national efforts to advance sustainable urban forest management. He holds a master's in natural resources from Oregon State University and a graduate certificate in urban forestry, with additional degrees from Rutgers University. Mike's background includes roles in state forestry, consulting, and volunteering on urban forestry boards and committees. He's passionate about the intersection of people and trees. What inspires him most is seeing how green spaces can transform communities, improve health, and bring people together. Rob Northrop is an retired extension forester with the University of Florida, where he has been working with them since 2004. The focus of his work involves forest management, teaching forest ecology and conservation science to natural resource and landscape design professionals, providing conservation planning assistance to local and state governments in Florida and Maryland, and applied research into the changing character and ecological function of urbanizing forests. In addition to his over 20 years of experience with the University of Florida, Robert has also worked as a technical watershed forester for the state of Maryland's Chesapeake Bay Restoration Program, served as an advisor to the Governor's Office of Maryland on Forest Management, and taught wildlife management at the University of Delaware. He was named an honorary member of the Urban and Community Forestry Society in recognition of his continuing commitment and outstanding service to advancing urban forestry. Our last panelist of today is Walter Passmore. and he is the State Urban Forester for California, managing a program that provides expert advice, partnership coordination, and grants to cities, counties, districts, and nonprofit organizations. He formerly served as the urban forester for the city of Palo Alto, California, Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas, and the community assistance forester for the Mississippi Forestry Commission. Walter holds a bachelor's degree in forestry from Cal Poly and a master of public administration degree from Cal State Dominguez Hills. His high school soccer coach loved his last name. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here, our panelists. Thank you, participants. We're going to start off today with our discussion, and after that, we will move into Q&A. So if you do have questions throughout today, please drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Lindsay will be monitoring that, and we will address those in the last half hour of our discussion today. So with that, let's start off. Before today's webinar, I had the great opportunity to meet with our panelists, and we discussed a lot of the aspects of urban forestry. And one of the major things that came up was just the definition of urban forest. What is an urban forest? So I would love to hear from each of our panelists what an urban forest is from your perspective and how you would define that. Whoever would like to start can go right ahead. Maybe let's take it off with you, Rob.
Okay. So, globally, cities are defined as contiguous urban cover. So, and it's usually measured by how much impervious surface there is, the percentage of impervious surface. I would suggest to all of you out there that how you define a city and then further how you define an urban forest has more to do with your management perspective and what you're trying to do. So the urban forest is a human ecosystem. It's formally regimented trees and shrubs along streets and boulevards, trees, shrubs, and other vegetation in residential yards, planned parks, woodlots, and of course, remnant native forests that still exist within how you define that city or that urban boundary. Thank you.
How about you, Seth? Would you like to take us off with your definition of urban forests?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, when you'll notice like in my super wordy title, Urban and Community Forestry Coordinator, right? So, we like to look at things from the terms of community forestry because 82% of Georgia's population lives in about 20 to 27 counties, somewhere in there. But then the vast majority of our individual communities are smaller. And when they hear urban forestry, they're like, we're not downtown Atlanta per se. So I always try to say community forests are literally the place where people interface with trees. That's trees on the way to school, work, where you go shopping, where you worship, all those things, right? And just the trees in backyards, streets. I mean, that's what I'll tell folks. And that has a big continuum, right? So you start getting the wild and urban interface becomes different, but where trees and people intersect is our community forests.
Thank you. How about you, Walter? Do you want to take over? And you're all the way over in California. Maybe yours differs a little bit over on the East Coast, from the East Coast.
My definition is actually pretty similar to Seth's. It's really the trees and the ecosystems that they anchor where people live. So it's that intersection of trees and people in an urban environment. And we obviously can get a lot more complex in our definition and explanation, but it's good to understand things in simple terms. So trees where people live is urban forestry.
Thank you. Mike, you're at the national level, working, like you said, you've worked with Seth, Walter, and Rob here as well. Do you have a different perspective on this work since you work it at a national level rather than a state level?
Thanks. Yeah. So trees where people are at are is the basic and greatest way to define this, because whether you're a major city or it's suburbia or more rural community, it's where people are at and trees are at working together. Um, I like to think of it as, because how we do our work is a geopolitical area of where trees and people intersect, because we do define based it on what we think is a city or rural area, which in my terms, I think we should start breaking down urban forest on a larger scale, just because managing urban forest doesn't stop at the boundary of our organizations. And I like to think of it as also just not just the street trees you drive underneath to every day and the park trees. It's also those areas of woodlots and your more forested areas that urban foresters should be investing in, which is good for wildlife habitat, and urban foresters should take more pride in doing work in that area.
Wonderful. So it sounds like we got two key ingredients here. People and trees makes up our urban forests. We have also spoken about the history of these ecological systems and how they're very different from how they used to be and how they've changed over time drastically. Um, Walter and Rob, whoever would like to go first, can each of you provide us with a brief overview of the ecosystem functions in an urban forest and how are these ecosystems modified from their historic ecology?
So I can start and then Rob can follow up. Really, urban forests are an amalgam of purposeful design, active maintenance, natural resilience, and historic ecology. As an example, in California, most cities are built in areas that were not historically forested. So, tree species, diversity, density, structure, location, and associated understory plants are often aggregated choices of individuals over time. It's the people that are really defining what an urban forest is. Introduced species may interact different with native species, thus changing ecosystem functions. Another example, in the savanna ecosystems of many coastal and valley cities in California, native valley oaks may support 300 animals, 1,100 associated plants, 370 fungi, and 5,000 insects and invertebrates. Valley oaks are a very drought resistant species, enduring months of dry weather in the summer. But when they're part of the urban ecosystem, seasonal water availability is modified because of irrigation and the other plants that we care for in urban areas. So that can impact valley oaks and the wildlife that depend on them. The changes that occur in urban environments may conversely benefit some wildlife species that are more opportunistic and adaptable, such as raccoons, squirrels, turkeys, geese. So, ecosystem functions such as shelter, connectivity, and food supply in urban environments may impact some wildlife species while benefiting others. And I'll just conclude by saying we're all familiar with species like pigeons, rats, mice that are very common in urban areas. But we should also remember that species that were once endangered, like peregrine falcon, may take advantage of these introduced species that thrive in urban areas. And we've seen with a species like peregrine falcon that it is actually thriving in urban areas where it was once heavily impacted in the rural areas of its native habitat. So there's good and bad to urban areas, and I'll let Rob provide some additional comments.
Thanks, Walter. Walter, of course, provides us with a great contrast. Me being from the Chesapeake Bay and from Florida, where our focus has been really on a more wet environment. So what's ecosystem function? You know, it's interactions among the components of ecosystems, the vegetation, the water, the soil, the atmosphere, the animals, that include exchanges of energy and nutrients, you know. So some examples are decomposition of organic matter, production of plants, biomass production, photosynthesis, and some of these functions provide services or outcomes that are important to people. And of course, we can't overstate that, and I know Seth and Mike and Walter have all said that, is that the most important thing to remember if you're going to manage either the more built environment in a city itself or trying to manage a conservation reserve or natural area in the city is that this is a social endeavor primarily. Our understanding of the biophysical processes, the structure, the composition of the forest, and our science are all important. But if we lose track of the fact that this is primarily a socially driven environment, we will never be successful in achieving conservation outcomes. So history and change. In the beginning of the 20th century, we had severe epidemics in cities due to water pollution and air pollution. Engineering scientists came in and have done a masterful job in correcting those problems. While doing that, they have modified the environment greatly with stormwater systems, with different systems that affect the air flows. And so when we work in the urban forest and we look at function, we have to remember that those functions have been greatly changed through the masterful job of engineers to protect human health. So, for instance, stormwater controls move water rapidly off the land to some output someplace. That is not the way the forest would have done it. The forest would have allowed infiltration. It would allow a great deal of evaporation. It would allow a great deal of slow groundwater movement towards streams. We wouldn't have had flash floodings. We wouldn't have flash movements of so these are functions that have changed over time that you and I now have to address. And of course, hydrology is extremely important. Soils can be another one that we can talk about. The heat island effect, heating up of soils, and it creates a warm soil environment. It influences and alters nutrient cycling and availability. You throw in there, like in New York City, some non-native earthworms working. All of a sudden, you have increases in mineralization, denitrification, and you have a loss of nitrogen for uptake by plants to support the urban forest. So these are functions, a little bit of history, and their influence on the urban forest in 20 seconds or less, right, Danica?
Yeah, you're making great time. You told me before this that you'd be timing yourself, so that's a lot of information, a little bit of time. I really appreciate that. So these systems here that we've been talking about, a big part of it too, like you were saying, the functions have been altered. They depend on a lot of different things. They're affected greatly by, the environment, natural disasters, things of that sort that can affect these systems and disrupt them greatly. And with that, there's a lot of environmental factors that threaten the conservation and the management of urban forests. Pests, disease, invasives, fire, natural disasters, a few I can mention. I want to turn it over to Seth here to talk maybe more on the local level, what he's seen in Georgia as far as how do we manage urban forests to be resilient to such threats. What environmental factors in Georgia, where you're at, where you have experience working, do you see in urban forests?
Yeah. So, we've been lucky in Georgia that some of the invasive tree pests and whatnot that have really hammered some other states, at least in the last 100 years, we have been, right? And so, I don't see wildfire or pest or drought taking out all of our forest in Georgia. But what I do see a ton of is not necessarily environmental impacts, but development pressure, and then all of the ancillary impacts that come along with that. So, when we start talking about anything, pest, disease, wildfire, natural disasters, whatever, what that essentially creates is disturbance and changes the succession plan of that community forest, right? A lot of times in Georgia, we have a very good long growing season, lots of rain. Disturbance typically leads to invasive plant species and becomes a big battle there. And but yeah, again, I'll say it's not environmental, but development pressure is the biggest thing we're seeing impacting our community forests, not only from that disturbance perspective, but also from a fragmentation perspective, keeping those wildlife corridors available, right? While we want to have urban wildlife, we don't necessarily want them interfacing with our grayscape and infrastructure, right? So that connectivity and or lack of connectivity and fragmentation becomes a big issue. When it comes to managing for those things, it becomes holistic forest management is like the cure all, right? On the last question, Walter and Rob were talking about, the historical impact. So when you look at Georgia, if before we built all of our cities, it was a big forest, right? So we've carved our cities into forests and then made choices, right, about what species we want to feature. And I always say it's kind of a tale of two urban forests in Georgia, where we have our chosen species and we have our natives that have come in. And again, that disturbance creates that primary succession, which are not always the most desirable species. When it comes to management, though, proactive management, just like managing a stand of timber, you manage your forest proactively. That is proactive pruning, that is plant health care, that is just making sure that we are prepared, right? So we do a ton of crown thinning, crown reduction, things like that in our coastal areas because we unfortunately get a lot of hurricane impact, right? In the northern part of the state where it's more mountainous, we do a lot of fuel mitigation things. So that way we save existing vegetation, because wildfires in North Georgia do dramatically shift vegetation cover and type, which can be advantageous for some species, but also negatively impactful for others. Yeah, I'll just say proactivity is how we go after that. And that can look a lot different. There's about 15 different ecoregions in Georgia. It's a very vast state with a lot of different forest types and ecosystems. So
That's a great transition over to bring it over to Mike with the difference in ecosystems and in just overall complexity of ecosystems across the nation here. And it does change from place to place. Environmental threats are different depending where you're at, and the frequency and intensity of those threats also differ. Mike, can you talk a little bit more, maybe on the national level, like what you're seeing as far as those threats that urban forests are facing right now, and how to manage for resilience in them?
Absolutely. So the toughest thing I'm going to say is the politics of urban forestry. People like to say trees aren't political. Those are one of the most politically things I can manage. So understanding the politics is going to be one thing, because you're asking urban foresters to manage resources that are supposed to be hundreds of years old on a scale of 2 to 4 years. So the communication of like how to manage urban forests to the ecology of an area has to be understood on a more general scale of how we're managing, and especially just what is going to be facing us with climate and changes to our area. Making sure you're on top of your research is a big thing here. One of the things about urban forestry is I've noticed across the nation is typically things like emerald ash borer, for example, hit the East Coast pretty hard, and it's slowly going west. So the people out west have had years to prepare for this. So making sure you're on top of what's happening in other areas and other regions as it spreads will help prepare your urban forest for tomorrow. So learn from your peers, learn from your others, talk more regionally about what you're doing urban forestry, because as a regional aspect of management, you can make more of an impact about your species diversity, what pests and diseases may be coming your way, and what to avoid. Um, and also, just frankly, start thinking of in advance about what your climates are going to look like. Look at the research models. What are you planning for your urban forests? So we're planting these trees today. They're going to be here hopefully 100 years from now. So making sure you're making those right choices for the species, for what you're planning for in the future. So you understand ideally what could be there. Because if we're planting trees that are there for today, in 15, 20 years, they might not survive due to drought or other stressors that we keep saying increasingly in other areas. So being on top of that and being informed about what you're doing is going to be key to making sure you're resilient. Other things is, like I said, working with, I would say like in Seth's position, Walter's position, state and local resources as well, making sure you're scaling up your projects, because people on the ground are important to understand what's happening locally, but scaling up into a state or regional area is important to understand as well, because you're going to have a larger impact on just benefits overall. Like we've talked about the hydrology, the ecology, and also you can start talking about locally, maybe how other cities are managing. One of the biggest things is always ordinance and land development. Other cities have gone through these kind of changes and ideas of how to do some of this stuff. So learning from how they do it and using the model instead of isolating yourself on an island, trying to figure out everything on your own. So learning peer to peers and explaining how you've gotten this ordinance passed where people pay into it for stormwater, and it can fund some of your tree offsets to help some of that stormwater. So just being aware of what's out there is super important on a national level, to understand how you're going to be impacted. So communication is the biggest key here, and also just do self-education, making sure you know what's out there, taking that initiative to understand what the researchers are putting out there and what they're doing. There's always good research out there and continuing to be out there. And as urban foresters, we need to be on top of that, as well as the community, because they can help push politically where these programs go.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Yes, and to reiterate, education and research, and not only just obtaining that, but allowing yourself the time to obtain that is essential. I think in all our professions, you do get better with education, you do get better research, you get better with communication with people who have that experience in those fields that you're trying to improve in. Seth mentioned a little bit too, one of the threatens environmental threats and leading to habitat fragmentation in urban forests, that being an issue, non-desirable species, all those things affect habitat within our urban forests. I would like to ask, how can we create or improve habitat in those forests? Rob and Walter, what are the challenges we face in providing habitat in the urban environment? Are there any wildlife species of concern that utilize urban forests? And if so, how do we manage for them? What's your take on managing for habitat? This whole series is largely focused around forests and habitat and how to manage for that. So give us your 2 cents. Rob, would you like to take us off?
Give you my 2 cents. My two cents is to remember again, this is a human ecosystem. Do not leave people out of this or people's opinions out of this. Their opinions are expressed through the ballot box and aggregated into the political people who are assigned to develop programs, projects, and set budgets for these urban areas. Always remember that political people are elected. And so if you can show that their constituency wants something enough, you are likely to receive a better audience. And so the political process can be addressed, but it needs to be addressed through the people, generally speaking. Okay? Even governors don't decide what to do unless they know that their constituents want that. So I'm going to get off my soapbox there for that one and get on to habitat. Okay, so habitat, creating wildlife habitat in cities appears to be gaining some popularity when we look at good social surveys. And again, I suggest that you also, for those of us who are natural resource managers, get some information, better understand what makes a good social survey, what makes a poor social survey, and begin to gain some education, as Danica would say, into building an ability to form consensus and other forms of social interactions with large groups. So wildlife habitat restoration, if you will, within the sanitary city is in fact a radical form of ecological restoration because it is an extremely disturbed system. Okay, so choosing what your outcomes will be important, and choosing who your allies will be important also. So an example, I'll give you an example from Florida, from the city of Tampa, that we have now written 2 urban forest plans for, and who, by the way, also recognize, as all of us who deal with wildlife should, that we need to understand the context in which we're working, the ecological context, the social context, the political context. And so that means that inventories are not one-off things. We should be beginning to think about adaptive management, about continuing to take inventories and social surveys so that we can begin to identify change over time. That's going to be critically important because the habitats we're trying to manage are what are known today in many cases as novel ecosystems. They're made up and comprised of species of plants and animals and microorganisms that have no reference point outside of the city. Keep in mind too about habitat is that the greatest diversity of species that exist, at least in the eastern United States, is under my feet as I walk across the soil. Okay, so wildlife, birds, real quick, Danica, I don't know if I got 2 minutes left, but I'll give you my 2 cents.
You got plenty of time. We're a little ahead of schedule, so.
So birds, birds are important, and they're a great focal point because birds are important to people. Okay, and we know that we have this great problem with migratory songbirds. One of our sponsors and supporters for this webinar, right? So what can we do with that? Well, we can garner great social support for that. That's good, okay? So how do we, as a scientist, play our role and our managers play our role within managing the urban forest for habitat for birds? Well, number one, if we're looking at the more developed parts of the city, the more urbanized parts of the city, you know, who is choosing the trees and shrubs that are being planted? And what are the attributes of those trees and shrubs that we are looking at? Okay, we know that Lepidoptera, moths, butterflies, the pupa, supply 97% of the birds, I believe is the way Doug Tallamy puts it, with critical food for fledging, for growing up the little guys and girls and getting them out of the nest. Okay, so we should be planting those native trees. Those native trees and the Lepidoptera have co-evolved, and so those native trees support those Lepidoptera, those moths, and those butterflies, and they support the birds. Who decides that? Landscape architects, urban foresters sometimes, and arborists. What about structure? Okay, composition and structure, right? 2 main pillars of habitat. Structure. Who is managing the structure of the trees in the truly urban environment? Well, I believe what you're going to find is that it's arborists who are maintaining or altering the structure of trees in urban forests. What they're doing is a masterful job of protecting the safety and the well-being of the people who live in the city. And that's really, really important. Can't dismiss that, right? But could they be doing more? Could they be managing the trees in a way that supports the birds, the vertical diversity of the branching that's so important for the diversity of the birds. Are there operations occurring when we have breeding bird seasons? Maybe that's not a great time for arborists to be out there in terms of the birds. Okay. In terms of our cities, parks, and our natural areas in the city, we need to be talking to the natural areas managers, and of course, all through the political system and all that, about deaden down debris. Okay. Keeping snags in place. All right. Again, planting what needs to be planted in terms of what is important for birds, okay, and managing the structure in a way that supports the birds. Now, all of this has to be done in a way that doesn't promote fire and that also doesn't lead to dangerous situations in which people are actively recreating and congregating. That goes without saying, okay? The other thing to keep in mind with Tampa is that it's along an important flyway. Okay. And birds, they're not quick, at least not the ones I've talked to. And so they are coming by and they're expecting the habitat that was there last year or 100 years ago. And boom, all of a sudden we've got a 1,000-acre development outside of Tampa, and that whole wetland upland complex is gone. So we need to do a better job of working on land change plans within cities also. And there's great examples of that come out of Maryland for the Forest Conservation Act and for Maryland's Critical Areas Act dealing with Chesapeake Bay. Both of those deal with land use change. And the two number one out goals, these are regulatory things, two outcomes. The goals are water quality, hydrology, which drives most all of our plants, which then creates the habitat, and wildlife habitat. So two good examples. Danica, I overdid it, I'm sure. So thank you very much, folks.
That was all great. That's great information. I totally agree. Adaptive management, identifying those changes by routine management, returning to those sites, doing your surveys. Species selection is huge. What are you managing for? All of that is extremely important. The changing environment around our urban forests greatly influences that habitat quality and also limits you and what you can do to provide that habitat. So I really appreciate you going in depth on explaining that. That is wonderful. Walter, would you like to add to that at all and give us a little bit of background on what you see, what we can do as foresters, land managers, biologists to have these systems function for habitat use for specific species or just as a whole?
Yeah, thanks. I'll build a little bit on what Rob said in that managing wildlife can be complementary with other values in urban areas, such as protecting streams, lakes, historic sites, trails, and parks. In addition to protecting typical habitats, species can be monitored for use patterns. So, a great example of a species that adapted to the urban environment is in Austin, Texas, where North America's largest urban bat population lives under the Congress Street Bridge that crosses Lady Bird Lake. Millions of bats come out, and it's actually a tourist attraction. So not only is Austin bat friendly, but that bat population also changes people's perspective on wildlife, and reiterating the importance of people and the decisions that people make in urban areas, that really can't be overstated. So in order to effectively manage wildlife, we need to engage with people, inform, educate, motivate, and we also need to assess our resources so that we can manage them wisely. one of the really primary factors in urban forestry is the spread of tree canopy. So there have been some links posted in the chat about tree canopy spread across various areas. We have a canopy cover analysis in California. Georgia has one as well. There's canopy cover data that is becoming more available, and also local inventory data so that we can compare canopy cover to the species composition of those areas. We can pair that with education and recognition programs. One that we use frequently in urban and community forestry is Tree City USA. I just stumbled across this morning an aligned program called Bee City USA. So it's catchy, and I think it helps us to get the word out to people that are making the decisions on how to care for the private property component of urban forest, which is oftentimes 80% or so of our urban environment. So we need to find ways to motivate the millions of property owners in urban areas to make good decisions that both promote good urban forestry techniques and good wildlife habitat.
Thank you, Walter, for adding on to Robert and continuing this conversation on habitat. Uh, we're just a couple minutes ahead of schedule what I'm planning, and I think since the main focus of this webinar series is largely driven by wildlife and managing habitat for them, Mike, do you mind if I pick on you to jump in a little bit and maybe give a couple minutes of your thoughts on managing habitat in our urban forests? It seems like it's not an easy answer. There's a lot at stake here and a lot to manage and work with. Could you give us a little bit?
Absolutely. And Walter was right. The crossroads with private property and urban forestry is where we are losing the battle. So understanding private owners have a lot more stake in this and managing is critical to understand how we manage our urban forests and the wildlife. So individual homeowners are going to have a large impact, especially when we're having that development Rob was talking about, like homeowner associations. A wetland's gone, that resource is gone, but there's houses there. What are you doing to integrate that? So really ensuring more programming around how do we develop more sustainably? How do we manage more sustainably, and talk to people who make those decisions, engineers, landscape architects. They learn enough about urban forestry and management of green infrastructure to do their jobs. They're not the profound people in this, knowing the arboriculture work like we are. So making sure you're building a good team. It's all about teamwork. Who do you want on your bus? Who do you want to be working with? Making sure you have a collaborative team effort, breaking down those silos about who's working in what areas, because that urban forest is encompassing of these departments. It's encompassing of the whole city. Who's impacting it? Really breaking that down is really where we need to start focusing our efforts, especially if there's departments involved. Your department can't operate in a bubble. You need to start working with each other and collaborating across different panels and different organizations. So that's another big thing here. And just also making yourself aware about what is in that area of your wildlife and habitat, because it's going to change state to state, region to region, areas to areas. I'm from New Jersey, so the Pinelands tree frog, big in the Pinelands, but you would not expect that in North New Jersey. So making sure you're informed about what species are in there and what you're managing for. And also urge urban foresters to think about trees are great. Kid planting a tree is always a great picture, but imagine giving urban forestry that cute cuddly face of an animal. So talking about how we can get trees in the ground through the idea of protecting wildlife is always a great topic to talk about and approach. So understanding what's being done, how to also integrate this onto properties, for example, schools for education, for environmental education component, making sure students actually get to see wildlife. integrate into their curriculum, going outside, seeing the stages of a butterfly, going out and understanding that. Walter's, I know they work with a lot. What is it? Green Schools. There's a lot of that. Yeah, I was like, I know the name. Great program to integrate that. So getting citizens involved and making sure they're educated on that level. So it's just going out there and breaking down those barriers is one of the important things, because there's so much that goes into our natural resource and ecology management that we all have a little piece of. So start making your own team, being the leader in your industry or in your department to make your own team, so you can have a more comprehensive understanding of how to manage these properties, because the director or the mayor or the council is not going to take that initiative to break down those silos. It's going to take one of the people on the ground to initiate that, or as Rob was saying, the community, the push from the community, that buy-in, the roots effort, or that I call them tree champions, or that champion of ecology. So making sure that you're coming together and being there and making your opinions heard about how you'd want to manage is really going to drive the force of how to make sure the wildlife is represented while we're thinking about development, while we're thinking about urban forests and what we're planting in the next generation, and getting that composition and structure, because that's a big thing. Do we plant all the streets with the same tree and at the same time? Well, no, of course not, because we've learned that's bad. But do we plant half the trees this year with large shade trees, and then in 5 years come back and put smaller trees that are ornamental underneath it, so we get that structure, get difference, and also a different attraction of birds? So really starting to think about your widening scope of planting changing too with urban forestry.
Great points, Mike. Thinking outside the box, talking to other people, like we said, like the main focus of all this conversation so far has come down to people. Urban forests are largely, everything is influenced by the people. Walter said something earlier about people's perspective on wildlife, how they're influenced by urban forests. And segueing into our next question, we're going to talk a little bit about ecosystem services. Maybe providing perspective is something that urban forests do provide. And, like you were talking about, Mike, people want to see that cuddly cute, whatever mammal hanging out in their urban forests, and it connects people to them for sure. So I want to take it back over to Seth. We haven't heard from you in a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem services that urban forests provide, and how we could even manage the urban environment to secure those services for the future? You can take it away.
Yeah, for sure. And before I dive into that, just a few things. I mean, you're talking about, Mike was talking about the clear roles, who's got what responsibilities. I think in this world that we live in of competing interests, right? A lot of arborists and municipal arborists are up against the wall that we have to focus on stormwater. We got to focus on energy savings, heat islands, extreme heat, and those are all great things to be combating through urban forestry. But the two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think Walter said it, like, you can manage your community forest and the added benefit of wildlife habitat improvement. And so when I talk about ecosystem services in the urban forest, I mean, I feel like we could talk the whole hour and a half today about that, right? Because that gets deep. So, I mean, obviously, preaching to the choir, we know heat island mitigation, stormwater mitigation, stormwater infiltration, the wildlife habitat, right? In the municipal level on public property, it becomes a balance between allowing for wildlife habitat trees, and snags and stuff, balancing that with municipal risk, right? And so always obviously encouraging, especially your municipalities and public space managers, to look for those opportunities where they can have limited risk associated with habitat trees. But with ecosystem services, it runs the gambit, right? Just for some quick perspective, just in the county that I live in alone, the Floyd County, Georgia, we avoid $152,000 estimated of cost associated with stormwater runoff, right? And that's just my one county of 159 counties. So, and when you start talking about securing those things for the future, it's working through people. Obviously, people's going to come up. My first day on the job as an intern, as an urban forester, was, Seth, you're going to learn urban forestry is as much about people as it is trees. And that's definitely held true. And, working through people, working through our elected leaders, through our decision makers, and providing the plethora of tools out there to measure, monitor, quantify, and evaluate those ecosystem services. A lot of there obviously are tree champions in every community, that want to plant trees out of altruism, out of beautification, all those things. But ultimately, we need our decision makers to make it a priority to have dedicated funds and programming to maintain or even grow, in some cases, our community forest canopy coverage. But again, through things like iTree, there's the iTree suites, all those things. A lot of your states, if y'all go and dig with your state forestry department, I'm sure there's tools that for each individual state, or at least a lot of states that aren't, maybe aren't as well known. So you can find this information out there. But iTree Canopy literally takes an hour and a glass of wine, and you can figure out a lot of stuff about your city, and then back those ecosystem services into values to then hopefully get the supports to manage your community forest holistically, not just for those functional physical ecosystem services, but then also ancillary with the wildlife habitat improvement.
That's great. Seth, how did you know I have wine while I research forestry? That's you're my mind.
If anybody's ever done an iTree canopy, it's a methodical process. It helps break it up. But it's super easy and valuable. It takes, like I said, look it up if you haven't used it.
For sure. We have a couple more minutes before we're going to turn it over to our participants. Mike, do you want to end this portion of our discussion today and just hop off of what Seth was talking about there, and maybe you can give us some information. Again, you're at the national level, how all the ecosystem services are that you've been seeing and how we can manage for those in the future as well. So just a couple of minutes and then we'll hand it over to our participants.
Absolutely. So one of the things here at SFI that was developed was the SFI Urban and Community Forestry Sustainability Standard. It is a very comprehensive framework of what a sustainable urban forest looks like. They've touched upon, like Objective 3 and 4 touches upon the natural resources, habitat, biodiversity, and also it has other objectives around community, indigenous relationships, wood utilization, and what that looks like. And how was developed was in the conjunction of that it's written prescriptively and not descriptively. So it's not a thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. This is the goal that you're kind of trying to accomplish. How does your city doing that? So utilizing that tool as a talking point about how you're doing things in your cities and potentially going forward would be a great way to engage and talk with the city council about, like, here is a third party who created the sustainability standard. Are we doing all these things, or are we accomplishing all these things? And to start building some of these plans around it. And another aspect is too, when you're developing these plans, talking to regional level. What are you doing? What is your neighbors doing? Can you both work together on planning efforts to make sure you're building habitat? Are you building that barrier for the next Eastie Beastie that's coming along to destroy your urban forest? So making sure you're having those regional discussions. And that way also too, when your management plans are talking, make sure they relate to each other. Because I've seen a lot of, like, here's a climate action plan, here's a sustainability plan, here's a management plan for trees. Well, they should all be talking to one another as those are developed, because each one of those is going to have a component that you need to pull from or work with in your ability. So making sure the planning efforts are aligned. And also just making sure in general what you're doing is aligned. One of my biggest pet peeves I've seen is that you see the road get uptaken, the trees come out, and then another 6 months later, the pipe needs to get fixed. And they were both scheduled, but nobody talked to each other. So doing work conjunctively, making sure that those projects are getting done, because that's also a good time when you're working with urban foresters to say, oh, the trees need to come out. Do we need to talk about constructed soil under the sidewalks? Do we need silva cells? How do we improve the environment for the trees as well? Since the sidewalk is already up or the roadway is already up, let's do the investment now. So really thinking about those long-term projects, because that's one thing in urban forestry. It breaks my heart to see those trees come down in 20 years or in 5 years after them being planted. It's just because of the neglect of like planning ahead of time. So making sure your alignment of that for the long-term eco benefits are there, because young trees have benefits. They really start kicking in after 20 years. That's when you start to see those benefits climb in those eye tree graphics that Seth was talking about. So you want those older trees. So investing not only in new trees, in your old trees, and making sure they're managed long term, because you're going to get benefits out of a 50, 60-year-old tree that it's going to take 10, 15 young trees. So making sure the cycle of those trees are thought through, because it doesn't stop at planting. Everybody loves to plant. It looks great. It's cute. It's fun, but we need to maintain. Maintenance is a big component with urban forestry too, because it's going to feed into wildlife. Like we've talked about, some of these species need an older tree or a certain size tree to nest or to feed on. We need to be able to have that.
I couldn't agree more. Long-term future perspective, that's a huge part of forestry. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank all of you for your wonderfully curated, thoughtful answers to my questions. This has been better than I expected. You all communicate well together, and I am just beyond thrilled. So let's move it over to our Q&A. Lindsay will take over here. She's been monitoring our Q&A. We have quite a few questions in here. We'll get to as many as we can in the next 25 minutes to half hour. Again, thank you guys. Let's see what our participants have for you.
All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to try and lump these into sort of groups of questions. So if you have an answer to the question, but also you want to veer off a little bit, that's probably okay. So first, I'd like for us to answer a number of the questions about invasive species that our participants have asked. So there are some specific questions like, how do you manage something like tree of heaven? How do you manage invasive species in an urban environment? And then also, how does the relative ability of an invasive or non-native species compare to the ability of native species to support insects and wildlife? Yes, Rob.
So going back to some of the research on the birds again, I keep using birds as an example, is that non-native trees, and we keep talking about trees, but of course trees, shrubs, and other vegetation make up the urban forest. There is no value except structural value. There is no food value provided by them. This has been shown by research that's gone back and looked at what we call nativized, or like species that have come in and have just become what we normally consider as part of the structure of the forest. So there's that. Also has that social aspect to it also, because most folks don't think about the things that the 400 of us think about or know about, right? And so they see a tree, like a Norway maple, like I did when I grew up in Brooklyn, and that was like it seemed like a native tree, right? So that's as far as invasive species coming in, when we think more about how we restore forests to a place where forests existed, like in natural areas or in parks or whatever, we can think about planting those native trees and picking the ones correctly that will create cover, shade, block the sun, block some of the environmental attributes that the non-native plants are encouraged by. Okay, and somebody put up a research thing about the trajectories of plant communities in parks. I think it was New York City they looked at it, where if you could produce more shade, you were likely to dampen the invasion of exotic species. A tough thing, because cities are the epicenters lots of times of invasive species, and also cities tend to be at critical points of transportation, whether they're ports along cities, along oceans. San Francisco, right? I mean, San Francisco is a big port. There's hardly any native species and plants in whole San Francisco Bay. So it's tough. It's tough in New York. It's tough in Savannah. It's tough in LA, you know. But we have these cities that are at these transportation nodes where the invasive species tend to come in to the environment first. Sorry, talk too much again. I'll let it go with that.
There's no too much talking, especially because
Eh,
you're on topic the entire time. So if you have a lot to say, we've got time to hear it. That's what we're here for. Yeah,
If,
Seth.
if I could just chime in a little bit too, I mean, yeah, so, I'll speak from a municipal arborist perspective. There's that pressure to have that structure, to have that shade, to have the stormwater interception, right? And I mean, a trident maple will grow in a chalky sidewalk vault, right? So you're under that pressure to have that impact. But so you're exactly right. It's the encouraging folks to find native trees that fit those same, the same criteria. Now in Georgia, and I always say until they build like a deep in the ground and long fence on the Florida line, we're going to have all the invasive species, right? Especially as climate shifting, the hardiness zones are shifting. We're getting a ton of subtropical species pushing up into our urban environments. And as Rob was saying, I mean, cities are not only the transportation hubs, but also the epicenter for disturbance. And that's what invasives thrive on. As far as management, grant funding and hard work.
I think sometimes we need to recognize too, Seth, and I know you know it, is that some of these invasive species are actually producing critical ecological services, and that their replacement at this point, uh, there are no logical ways to replace them. I'll give you an example again from uh, semi-tropical Florida, where we have mangroves, right, along the Gulf Coast. But because of shifts in climate, and not big climate change, but just changes, we get a cold spell and we lose the mangroves right where I lived, because it's right at the limit of how far north they can go. They leave, and Brazilian pepper comes in. Okay, okay. So want to get rid of Brazilian pepper on 50 miles of coastline? A little tough, you know. But what is it doing? Well, it's stabilizing the coast, right? And it is producing ecological benefits because it is a plant. So invasive species and non-native species in some of these areas are producing significant ecological services.
That's really interesting to think about. I don't think that comes up quite as often in our, I guess the opposite of urban is rural, non-urban forests. That what else are they really providing to us that maybe is so critical we really can't afford to try to extirpate them. Mike, this one I think will be mostly directed to you, but please, if anyone else has comment, please chime in. Some of our participants has found that politicians are a lot of times swayed by the loudest voice in the room and not necessarily, the groundswell that is the most popular opinion, or that a lot of more local political groups like county commissioners boards uh, have a lot of influence over natural resource management, city planning, that sort of thing. Do you have strategies for either managing kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease thing, or how to start conversations with your local or regional um, commissions or other political groups that have influence over those things?
Yeah, and I am sure others here will have their, it depends on where you are everywhere, which political scheme you're in. Every state is different. Like New Jersey is a home rule state, so there's state ordinances, and the local level has a little bit more say what happens. So just knowing what you're getting into. Biggest thing, showing up. Don't feel defeated from the start. Show up to these meetings, make your voice be heard, um, be louder, um,
I
be
saw
proud
a
of what
guy
you're doing.
dance up to the podium a while back. Maybe.
Do what you got to do to make it you're known. And also partner. There is a lot of nonprofit partners locally that do this work, especially in urban forestry. And if there's not one near you, reach out to the urban forester, reach out to the people doing this stuff. We can find you. There are national partners that do stuff, Arbor Day Foundation, SFI, American Forests. There are people out there that are willing to play in your corner and help support what you're doing. The state coordinators like Seth and Walter, big. They can't sometimes do political outreach, but they can point you in directions of how to do it and give you information of how to support your stuff. So making sure you have a network there and where you're working is super important. Universities with research, I would say it's hard nowadays to fight facts, but we've seen otherwise. But being informed about what's going on and using the universities and what's happening. Students, big people with a lot of students nowadays want to be informed what's happening, working with groups like that, the next generation, hoping that change will come in. And always too, like we said, they're voted in. If the most popular belief is what's going to show us a change, make the noise in the university, start having petitions, work on that stuff. Just build capacity in any way you have your free time, find other people related. Social media is a great way to get traction of what's going on, because nowadays information moves like that. You never knew. News network's going to pick something up, a writer's going to find something. You kind of have different ways and avenues to start doing that. There's no wrong way to do it unless you're just like, breaking the law. Don't do that. Like, don't be rogue chainsaw cutting a tree down or anything of that nature. But just use what's out there for you and working with it, and just make your voice known, being the squeaky wheel, getting that, because you never know who also in the audience when you're talking at some of these meetings also is having these thoughts or is also having that. And even I will say, I've talked to land developers, engineers. A lot of them want to do the right thing. They just don't know where to go. And they have a lot more political push sometimes. So talking with them about it and saying like, hey, we know you're developing in that. And usually they're the bad one in this situation, but they're willing to work with it. They wanted to save trees as well. I've talked to a couple developers that I was like, hey, a couple of massive trees on these properties. Can you work it? They'll move roads as long as they're not already in the stage of like physically doing stuff, but they're willing to work with you on these things. So just having those conversations and making it known is really well the best way to do this, and just partnering. I think the nonprofit partners have a big impact of what they're doing, and it glows to like a regional scale, especially at the county level. You can start talking about it. Like if your neighboring towns also are having these issues, if you pull together at a county level and say like, we both want to do this, it's harder for the county to refuse a couple organizations wanting something.
Yeah, well,
So let me just add a little bit to what Mike said. By encouraging people to speak in terms that decision makers will listen to. Oftentimes, the biggest obstacle to doing something different is economics. And so we need to frame urban forestry in terms of this is something you can't afford not to do, right? If you don't engage in urban and community forestry, you are going to be spending lots of money that you don't need to spend. If you don't engage in urban and community forestry, your tax revenue is going to decline and you'll have less for other services. So, as an example, we recently completed an economic analysis in California that showed the urban and community forestry industry generated over $12 billion to the economy, 78,000 jobs. There are similar studies that have been done regionally and nationally in other parts of the country. And that's just the urban forestry industry. If you look at the amount of state and local tax revenue that's collected in California, we found over $1 billion contributed to state and local tax revenue. We're only spending about $600 million of that. And I think that that is going to be similar in other states where the amount of money that's generated by the industry and the ecosystem benefits is far more than we're spending on maintaining our urban and community forest. So if we can put it in terms that decision makers understand, it's not the fluffy, feel good, we're getting more wildlife. It is we're able to generate the economy to provide essential services to our residents.
Yeah, Rob.
So Walt is making some great points, and when we communicate, we are not just speaking, we are hoping that somebody is getting it. And so we have to recognize that we understand certain things, the person we're speaking to understands certain things, and we have to communicate in a way that is appropriate for the audience. Again, I go back to telling you that if you're concerned about the managing of wildlife on a regional urban basis, or you have wildlife refuges or whatever, that you're concerned about, or you're an urban forestry program and you're trying to just manage the urban forest, which also supports the habitat, okay, you have to express it in ways that can be understandable. I'll give you an example. Down in West Central Florida, I helped Hillsborough County to develop a strategic plan for their conservation lands. That's 80,000 acres of habitat for rare, threatened, and endangered species. Okay, it's a county program. It's one of the biggest ones in the whole country. Okay, so they were about to become defunded because the county commissioners didn't understand what the big deal was about wildlife. Okay, what was the big deal about threatened and endangered? They weren't threatened federally, but we did have threatened state and endangered and problems with wildlife. So we had this 80,000 acres. Well, what we did was we created a strategic plan for how to manage those areas. And folks, if you're involved in planning, you have to recognize that conservation is a long-term, unending dialogue between the society and the physical environment. So you got to understand how to do strategic planning. But one of the things that was most important was that we worked with EPA to develop a model for assessing the ecological services. Then we took that to the county and said, well, we just figured out that along with EPA, which gave us credibility, right? Because, who the hell was Rob Northrop and a couple of wildlife biologists, right? But the folks from EPA say that your lands are producing $99.8 million of ecological services to your community every year. And that meant that within 3 years, that those lands had already paid back everything they ever spent on them. And they stopped. And they said, wow. And then we put that out through newsletters and stuff like Mike says, and all of a sudden there's a lot of people out there saying, wow, what are you doing? You're going to cut this? This is ridiculous. And that didn't even count the recreational values. Okay? So those are important. When I talked to the city mayor of Tampa, the first time I met with him, he's a really nice guy. He says to me, he said, Rob, he said, I don't even know the names of any trees. That's the first thing he said to me. I said, that's okay. You don't have to. What you need to understand is that the urban forest reduces attention deficit disorders in the children in your city. And he looked at me and he said, that's something he could relate to. That's something he could go out and say, this is worth doing because it's helping our children and reducing, a problem, a disease that's affecting people. So that's it.
Now I'm very happy that I mostly deal with the tree part of trees and not as much the people part of trees. That sounds incredibly complicated. Thank you for your responses on that. And I think simple, actionable steps that people can take toward those efforts. Kind of shifting over to the physiological side, could you talk about soil compaction and how that affects the forestry choices, or I guess ideally on the front end of that, the planning choices in urban forests?
Um, I can jump.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about planning ahead. I mean, there's a lot of little granular things that go into that with your development plans, but designated vehicular traffic routes, right? Because we all know that first pass creates most of the compaction. But I mean, that is a huge deal, at least in Georgia. A lot of heavy clay soils. Compaction is a huge problem, especially on playgrounds. We love to plant trees at schools, not near to the level that Walter and them do, but we try. But I always say that playgrounds are one of the hardest places to make a tree live, and it's due to that compaction level. So Georgia also has a long agricultural history that resulted in a lot of like hard pan, like sub compaction. So that's another thing we battle. But it's all in the planning process, right? And then ultimately making your species selection that can handle lower oxygen thresholds.
Can you give a
Yeah.
few examples?
I mean, yeah. So, I mean, bald cypress, I know that's a very limited part of the country, but that's my go-to tree for a tough spot. And people are always like, really? Bald cypress and a dry vault on the sidewalk? I'm like, it just thinks it's a dry swamp. So, that's a great example. But then on like the flip side of that, like maples traditionally need a lot of oxygen. So in Georgia, we end up with maples with tons of surface roots, and that comes with all the other impacts. So those are just two little examples, but yeah, it's compaction is a huge problem in urban
Do you have a
plantings.
method for remediating compacted sites if you would like to reforest an area? A successful
So
method?
yeah, I mean, if you are get a good operator and someone with the time, I love to take an excavator and do lift and drop. So just pick up huge chunks and drop it over and over. It takes forever. I always say you got to crack many eggs to make an omelet in that type of situation. But that's really going to be the only thing that's going to undo that in a quick enough manner. But obviously, there's smaller methods. You can do radial trenching and vertical mulching. Organic mulch material does decompact surface soil over time. It just takes a long time, but um, getting an excavator or a garden tiller, that's about it for me.
I had my planned next question was about fire in urban areas, but there has been just a quick deluge of questions about Rob and the EPA and what is that tool and how do you get the EPA to do that economic evaluation work for you and sharing some of those other resources. Because of the number of questions, would you mind just quickly, Rob, sharing with us? Um,
No, not at all. It came first off. It came about because we were doing talking about wildlife management, right? We were initially attempting to look at the urban forest as the forest in the city and the forest in the city in the forest, and so we were beginning to map out, evaluate the entire watershed of the Tampa Bay. Okay, that was what we were considering in the urban forest, the entire watershed, which encompassed about pieces of 4 different counties. So anyway, it got all involved that way. And of course, Tampa Bay was one of the bays that were involved in the EPA's program for estuary renewal. So they came to us because we had so much information about the forest that nobody had ever collected that they needed that to create their model. Okay, that's the other thing, folks. I got to tell you. So what's cool is if you do these analyses, if you collect this data, if you begin to be able to describe where it is you're trying to work, it's like candy to scientists, right? It's like free, good. I mean, if you do it right, it's like candy to them. They can't resist but come and work with you because you've already done so much of the work they need to get started in their research projects. That's what happens with EPA. If you want to know about the model that was produced, and it was a model that was produced specific to the Tampa Bay region, because that's what we were doing, it was broadened out, generalized for uses in other parts of the country also. email me. Okay, just email me. I'm okay. I'm retired, but hey, I care about what you're doing. You know, and I know that you don't have enough money, you don't have enough people, you don't have the right equipment, and nobody listens to you. So I'll listen to you, but I don't know whether I can help you very much except with some more information.
We appreciate that, Rob. I like your brand of casual optimism. Okay, we are at 125, and to make sure that we have enough time for sign off and to reiterate a few of the things that we talked about at the beginning of our webinar, I am going to go ahead and wrap that up unless any of our panelists has anything else they'd really like to share. All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. As a reminder to all of our participants today, we are moving off of the Zoom platform to Teams starting on our next webinar in October. Our webinar in October will be on October 28th at noon Eastern Time. We did move it back a week so that we didn't overlap the National Society of American Foresters Convention. Didn't think we could pull an audience away from that. So please, you will need to re-register. We are very sorry about that. We have not found a way to transfer everyone. Please go and register at the link that just dropped into the chat, and we will also email that out to you. Danica, do you have anything you'd like to?
I would just really like to thank our panelists today. They've been amazing to work with. They've made themselves available for this, available for all of you. I hope you all walk away getting some of your questions answered, feel a little more confident in your pursuit of urban forestry. Again, if it weren't for our panelists, if it weren't for our participants, this wouldn't be possible. All the people working in the background, Lindsay, Gwyneth, the two on here to name a couple. Everyone works very hard to bring this to the public. So thanks again. Like Lindsay said, I'm going to say it again. Please register for the next webinar. It's going to be on October 28th, and old growth, mature forests. It should be a good one, that's for sure. But thank you all, and we'll see you in October.